It's a familiar performance. A professional believer stand before us, affecting an air of scholarly gravity, and attempts to convince us that a nomadic preacher from a backwater Roman province was actually the architect of the universe. The core argument of this video is a tired exercise in historical triangulation. Multiple sources, proximity to events, and a fit within the cultural setting. She wants you to believe that because a few people scribbled about a man decades after his supposed death, the entire supernatural house of cards, the virgin birth, the resurrection, and the eternal fire must be treated as a sober fact. It's a classic bait and switch. She starts with using the tools of the historian to establish a real person, and then pivots to demanding your submissive worship of a deity. It's a pathetic attempt to bridge the gap between the mundane and the miraculous, using the flimsy planks of hearsay and oral tradition. We are expected to marvel at the early evidence of Paul's letters, written 20 years after the fact, as if 2 decades isn't plenty of time for a local cult to transform a dead man into a celestial icon.
Did Jesus of Nazareth really exist? Jesus is one of the most influential figures in history. Today there are billions of people who identify as Christians, and even the calendar that we use is based on the time we associate with his life. That said, there are some people who claim that Jesus never existed, that he's just a mythic, legendary figure who early Christians invented. So in this video, we're going to look at how historians evaluate people from the ancient world, and we will apply those methods to Jesus to see whether or not we have good reason to believe that he was a real person or just a legend. So unlike today, people who lived 2,000 years ago rarely had physical objects that historians can directly link them to. There are rarely statues or inscriptions or official records from a person's lifetime. And of course, there were also no photographs or videos or social media accounts. So historians tend to ask, when they're asking whether or not a person existed, they're looking usually for written accounts that mention that person, things like letters or biographies or histories written by later authors.
Notice the immediate appeal to written accounts, as if the mere existence of ink on parchment is a surrogate for truth. She mentions biographies and letters written by later authors, but conveniently skips over the fact that these authors were biased devotees with a vested interest in the myth. In any other field, we would call this propaganda. In religion, they call it historical evidence. She brings up Socrates as a shield, noting he didn't write anything either. This is a desperate false equivalence. We don't worship Socrates as a son of a god who can save our souls from a lake of fire. The stakes for believing in Socrates are zero. The stakes for the Jesus myth involve surrendering your intellect to a system of celestial surveillance and moral blackmail.
When they're asking whether or not a person existed, they're looking usually for written accounts that mention that person, things like letters or biographies or histories written by later authors. And they're asking questions like, are there multiple sources that mention the person? How close in time are those sources to the events that they describe? And then, do the accounts fit with what we know about the historical setting? When several early sources mention the same individual and those accounts align with the historical context of the time, historians generally consider that to be strong evidence that the person did exist. One example is that most of what we know about the philosopher Socrates, it doesn't come from Socrates himself. It comes from other writers. Socrates didn't write anything, but historians still widely accept that he was a real person because there are multiple early sources that mention him. Those sources were written in or very close to his lifetime, and then the descriptions fit with what we know about life in ancient Athens, where Socrates' life took place. And so, with this framework in mind, let's now look at the sources that mention Jesus.
The argument that these stories fit the historical setting is particularly amusing. Of course they fit. They were written by people living in the setting, and they were reverse engineering prophecies to match ancient Jewish texts. If I write a story today about a man in New York who flies, and I mention the Empire State Building, does the building's existence prove that the man can fly? She leans on Paul's letters from the 50s AD as being actually pretty early. In the world of biology or physics, a 20-year gap between a claim and its evidence would be laughed out of the room. But in the twilight of theology, we are told to be impressed that the legend only took a generation to fully metastasize.
With this framework in mind, let's now look at the sources that mention Jesus. The earliest sources that mention Jesus appear in the New Testament, especially Paul's letters and the four Gospels. So these authors wrote in the first century within just a few decades of Jesus' life. There are many scholars who date Paul's letters to about the 50s, which is 20-ish years after Jesus' death. And you might be thinking that's a long time, but by ancient standards, that's actually pretty early. For comparison, many of the surviving biographies that we have of Alexander the Great, they were written more than 400 years after he lived, but historians still consider him a well-established historical figure. Okay, so Paul's letters refer to Jesus as a real person who lived in recent history, who was crucified, and whose followers believed that he rose from the dead. And then the gospel authors, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John,
here we have the synoptic problem treated with the reverence of a holy mystery rather than the editorial mess that it actually is. She glosses over the fact that these four authors can't agree on the genealogy, the birth, or even the final words of their protagonist. It's a helter-skelter accumulation of discordant documents that show every sign of being tampered with over the centuries. The author of Luke is praised for carefully investigating, yet he relies on the same eyewitness reports that are actually just recycled oral traditions. It's a circular exercise. Luke says he's accurate so you can be certain of what you were taught, provided you don't ask where he actually got his information from.
They wrote their accounts later in the first century, and their ancient biographies describe Jesus' life and his teachings and his execution. And I personally appreciate that the author Luke explains at the beginning of his gospel that he carefully investigated the events of Jesus' life and ministry and tried to write an orderly account so that the person he's writing to, Theophilus, could be confident about what he had been taught about Jesus. So Luke said, "Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used the eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." Because these New Testament texts were written by people who believed that Jesus was God, we might wonder whether or not historians should actually use them and treat them as historical evidence.
She admits these texts were written by people who believed that Jesus was God, but then claims historians don't exclude them. This is a half-truth. Serious historians do exclude the supernatural claims as being outside the realm of historical inquiry. You can't use a biased religious tract to prove a miracle any more than you can use a comic book to prove the existence of Krypton. She compares the reverence for Jesus to the reverence for Alexander the Great. Again, the difference is that Alexander didn't claim to be a co-eternal part of a trinity that requires you to hate your family to follow him. Alexander's existence doesn't demand that you stop thinking and start kneeling.
And I think it's fair to wonder that, but good to remember that historians do study texts by authors who have their own beliefs and viewpoints. In fact, every single historical source, whether it's ancient or modern, it does reflect the perspective of its author. So we'd have to get rid of everything if we weren't able to do that, right? Many of the works of Alexander the Great, for example, were written by people who revered him, but scholars don't exclude those texts to determine whether or not he existed. And in the same way, they don't exclude the New Testament authors to determine whether or not Jesus existed. There are also several non-Christian sources from the ancient world that mention Jesus. One of the most well-known examples comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote in the early 2nd century, around the year 116 AD. And in his history of the Roman Empire called Annals, Tacitus describes the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero, and he explains where the movement came from. He wrote, "Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus." And this reference is significant because Tacitus was not a Christian, and not only that, he was suspicious of and hostile towards Christians.
Now she trots out the non-Christian sources, Tacitus and Josephus. Tacitus wrote in the 2nd century, repeating what he heard about a movement, not documenting a man he met. As for Josephus, his testimony is widely regarded by actual scholars as a later Christian forgery or interpolation. She calls Tacitus significant because he was hostile to Christians. This proves only that by 116 AD, Christians existed and were annoying the Romans. It says nothing about the veracity of a resurrection a century earlier. It's like saying that because people today hate Scientologists, Xenu must be a historical figure.
There are also several non-Christian sources from the ancient world that mention Jesus. One of the most well-known examples comes from the Roman historian Tacitus, who wrote in the early 2nd century, around the year 116 AD. And in his history of the Roman Empire called Annals, Tacitus describes the persecution of Christians under the Emperor Nero, and he explains where the movement came from. He wrote, "Christus, from whom the name Christians had its origin, had undergone the death penalty in the reign of Tiberius by sentence of the procurator Pontius Pilatus."
She then cites the mention of James, the brother of Jesus, as indirect proof. Even if we grant that a man named Jesus had a brother, it doesn't move the needle 1 millimeter towards the claim that he was a divine being who walked on water. History is full of charismatic preachers who had siblings. It doesn't make their metaphysical claims land any less than this absurd one. She mentions Pliny the Younger and Suetonius, who also only write about the movement. The video is desperately trying to conflate the growth of a cult with the truth of its doctrine. By this logic, the rapid growth of Islam or Mormonism should be taken as proof of their contradictory revelations.
And this reference is significant because Tacitus was not a Christian, and not only that, he was suspicious of and hostile towards Christians. So even as a critic, he's confirming that Jesus was a real person who was executed under Roman authority in the 1st century. There's also the Jewish historian Josephus, who wrote near the end of the 1st century, and in his history of the Jewish people called Antiquities or Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus mentions the execution of James, identifying James as the brother of Jesus, who was called Christ. And this brief reference shows indirectly that Jesus was known as a real person in the first century. There are also other ancient references to Christians and their beliefs from Roman writers like Pliny the Younger and Suetonius. And while these sources focus more on the early Christian movement than on Jesus himself, they do, again, indirectly show that people across the Roman world referred to Jesus as a real person who had lived, and that many of his followers believed that he was divine, but that last part is a topic for another video. So if you remember those three criteria, those three questions we talked about at the beginning of the video, are there multiple sources that mention the person? How close in time are those sources to the events that they describe? And then do the accounts fit with what we know about the historical setting? The sources that we just talked about give historians multiple early and independent sources that mention Jesus. This includes writings from both followers of Jesus and critics of Jesus.
The consensus, she claims, is a manufactured one, built on the assumption that if you repeat a story enough times, it becomes fact. She talks about independent sources, ignoring that the Gospels are largely plagiarized versions of one another. The fit with the historical context of Roman rule is just set dressing for a supernatural drama. She wants you to be impressed that these sources appear within a short period of time. But in 20 years, a man can go from a local carpenter to a cosmic deity in the eyes of a few desperate, obsessed, oppressed people. Time doesn't turn a lie into truth. It just makes the lie harder to untangle.
They also appear within a relatively short period of time after the events that they describe, especially when you compare them to, many other figures from ancient history. As well, these sources fit with what we know about the historical context of the time, like the Roman rule in Judea, or Jewish religious movements, or the practice of crucifixion as a punishment for perceived political threats. When historians consider all of these factors together, the consensus is strong that Jesus of Nazareth was a real historical person. As the non-Christian New Testament scholar Bart Ehrman said in an interview, I don't think there's any serious historian who doubts the existence of Jesus. There are a lot of people who want to write sensational books and make a lot of money who say Jesus didn't exist, but I don't know any serious scholar who doubts the existence of Jesus.
Quoting Bart Ehrman is a classic appeal to authority. Ehrman may not doubt a historical Jesus, but he certainly doesn't believe in the Christ of your faith. The video uses his name to lend academic respectability to a project that is fundamentally about reinforcing uncritical belief. She concludes that question of existence is not considered controversial. This is the ultimate nothing to see here tactic. She wants to shut down the skeptical inquiry before you start asking why an omnipotent God would reveal himself only to a few illiterates in a desert and then fall silent for 2,000 years.
Of course, historians still disagree about many aspects of Jesus' life and identity and whether or not he was God, but the question of whether or not he existed at all generally is not considered controversial among historians. Jesus was a real person, not a legend later invented by Christian writers. So now that we know Jesus existed, the next question is, who was he? So in the next video, we are exploring who Jesus actually claimed to be. And if you like, you can watch it by clicking the video on the screen just now. Otherwise, in the comments, I'm curious, before watching this video, had you heard the claim that Jesus might not have existed? And what surprises you most about how historians study the ancient world? If you have other questions about Christianity that you'd like to cover in future videos, feel free to leave those in the comments as well. And if you'd like to see more content like this, then you can click the subscribe button just below the video, and I'll see you next week.
We've seen this script before. It begins with the humble admission of a few puzzles and ends with a demand for total intellectual surrender. Religion spoke its last intelligible words a long time ago. What we are watching here is just the echoing repetition of yesterday's fables, cranked up to ward off the terrible emptiness of a godless universe. It's a babyish attempt to meet the demand for knowledge using the tools conceived in the bawling infancy of our species. The real miracle isn't that a man rose from the dead, but that we, who share DNA with ancient bacteria, have evolved enough to see through these manufactured delusions. We don't need a middle nation or a sacred house to find wonder. The universe is far more awesome and chaotic than any creation story could ever hope to be. It is time to grow up, put away the binkies, and face the strong wind of understanding. How much effort it takes to affirm the incredible, to squirm in the awareness of sin while pretending that you are the object of a divine plan. The promised land isn't a celestial garden. It is the freedom of an examined life, lived without the fear of an invisible man in the sky. We are the offspring of history, and we must establish our own paths in a universe that is refreshingly indifferent to our suffering, comings and going, and ultimately, that is what I leave you with today.